All right, we will start our Public Service Committee meeting on Tuesday, June 9th. Review and approval of minutes.
Move to approve Erpenbach.
Second, Anderson.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Motion carries. First up, Mike Cooper with Director of Planning and Building Services. We are having our follow-up meeting on the subdivision ordinance, etc. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Mike Cooper with Planning and Building Services. And joining me today, Fire Marshal Dean Lanier. We were with you back in March to discuss the general topic about subdivision access roads, development standards, and those kind of things. And we were asked to come back and give you an update. So we're not putting a formal presentation up on the screen, but what we want to do today to start out with is Dean has been out working with his team to look at these different development areas. And there's about 5 that we specifically were talking about previously. But I want to have Dean give you just kind of a general overview of where we're at in terms of compliance with the fire code requirements, talk about some specific development areas, and then I'm going to follow up with some further discussion. So we'll start with Dean.
Welcome.
Afternoon, Council. Dean Lanier, Fire Marshal with Sioux Falls Fire Rescue. Today, just to talk briefly about some of the subdevelopments that we've talked about in prior conversations. I had 4 on my list. They included Canterbury Heights, Diamond Field Estates, Whispering Woods, and Legacy Ridge. I'm happy to be able to report to you that over the past few months, we've continued to work with the developers. At this point, and we're focusing only on meeting the provisions of the fire code for emergency access, we are compliant with those subdevelopments. But that's a pretty narrow scope. It doesn't include public access ways, and we're not talking about paved road surfaces. So the scope is a bit narrowed with respect to how we apply the fire code. In the coming months, we'll be talking with both developers as well as local contractors about the implementation of the 2015 International Fire Code. That will give us the opportunity to take a look at some of the provisions in fire code and see if there are modifications or changes to be made in those areas. We do have a policy letter that has been revised since 2007. I think the last revision was in 2013. That is a standing interpretive policy about emergency access provisions, and we're looking at making small changes and modifications to that and how we interpret and apply those rules. So that's another area that with the code revision process coming up, it gives us the opportunity to review those areas of interpretation. So if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Questions by committee members? Councilor Erpenbach.
I guess not really a question so much, and you said it, but the big concern that I've heard from people when we started this conversation was, I live in a subdivision that only has one way in and one way out, and so that must not comply. And so I think that's what's key here is that we're talking about fire code. We're talking about driving a fire truck in there that's got 8 wheels or whatever, and it can really handle that terrain. Yeah. We're talking about safety issues. We're not just talking that there's more traffic in your neighborhood than you'd like to have. And so I think that's the key part of this conversation for me.
Sure. I would point out that the growth that we're experiencing in subdevelopments is giving us a unique opportunity to, in essence, grow our way out of the problems. It's been consistently happening across the city in almost every sector that we look at. The pace of the growth is kind of astounding at some points that we look and we see how much we're getting done within just a 2 or 3 short month period. So if things continue as they have in the past, these problems are going to quickly resolve themselves because the amount of growth we see is quickly starting to address the issues that we're having.
Good.
Mr. Anderson?
Well, this is something that has come up out of pretty much the Canterbury issue. And what I've seen this as being is an issue between when do we go from a temporary fire access to a permanent secondary access for that neighborhood. And that's where I see that, I feel that we have a gap between the fire code and then our regular ordinance. And that may have come about during that time period when we saw a housing shortfall, and we did some things as far as working with the developers to allow them to keep developing and not having to put in that permanent access. So I'm very happy that at least we are looking at this and identifying those areas, because as Councilor Urfenbach said, even Saturday morning I had a former city employee, matter of fact, high-level director, say where he lives is a giant cul-de-sac too, which is down off of 69th and southeastern area, some of that new build there. So I hope that, you know, these discussions can continue with the home builders and the developers so that we can come up with a good resolution to this.
There has been a lot of engagement, I can tell you that up front. So my opportunity is to go back to IRAB as well as sub-developers and designers and developers in the area has been consistent. We've had continuing conversations with them about this, and they understand. I think they understand better our expectations for a subdevelopment design at this point. I don't think there's a whole lot of confusion about that anymore. We've been engaged with them about our expectations from the very beginning, and I think that learning curve for them is starting to improve. We don't see the kind of isolation that we might have seen years ago with how developments are planned from their initial onset, from their early phases.
And if I may, just the last statement, and I've said this to you before, Chief Lanier, and I've said it to Mike Cooper, is that, you know, one of my major concerns is, you know, in case there is that catastrophic event, our firemen, our policemen, our first responders, they put their lives on the line every day. But I don't want them to have to put their lives on the line just trying to get to where they're going to be helping people. That's where this all came about.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Councilor Stagers?
No, I don't.
No? Okay.
Don't leave. While Dean's still up here, I wanted Dean to talk about, you know, he mentioned the fire code. We're currently working with a 2012 version. We do the 3-year updates, so we're going to be bringing forward the 2015 version. But I wanted to have Dean just talk again about the current requirement of the 30 structures, the time frame of how that may change. We've been talking about implementing a 5-year time period. So I just want to have Dean maybe talking about some of the discussions that we're going to have as we bring forward the 2015 code revisions.
So with the example of Copper Creek Estates on the screen up there, I can talk to you briefly about how we start off with a phased approach to subdevelopments. Initially, a developer will bring their preliminary plans to us and talk to us about where they plan on making access into a subdevelopment, and then how they plan future phases based upon that first phase development. In this case, the south end of the development there to your right, you can see a straight-in approach off of, gosh, I can't see that very well. Yes, it's a good thing. Yeah, I know where this development is, but I can't remember the streets off the top of my head. So,
The top is East 26th.
East 26th Street, that's right. So, in a phased approach, what we're trying to do is make sure that we've addressed the needs of that 30-unit maximum in the initial phases. And just, I can tell you just from recalling this phased approach, the area that you see just to the, just to the left, that U-shaped, well, it actually looks like an N shape. Yeah, that was actually the first phase of this development, and if you count those units out, you'd come to right about 30 homes. And that was the initial phase that we accepted and approved. The other phases were done in different blocks, and there's a natural ravine that's running through that development from east to west that kind of peaks to the north from left to right, and that's the reason why that broke off. So that area is a separate phase. So what we're trying to get is a more comprehensive plan from the very onset, from the time that the preliminary gets drawn, so that there's clear understanding that these 30 units are the maximum in which we can go before we need to bring in a secondary access to that location. And the planning needs to be far in advance, not after we get the 30th unit done. So we're doing a much better job of making sure that those expectations are well understood early on in the preliminary subdevelopment process. The 2015 codes, I'll talk to you briefly about that. They do come out in the 3-year cycle. I know there's concern about the pace and often it seems like we're always here with a new code revision process. But often you'll find in the revision process for the fire code, many of the things that get changed are as a result of technology changes and amendments to code where things didn't quite work as well as what code developers and writers hoped for. So you'll see changes to fire code with respect to the types of systems that are allowed, the acceptance of certain types of systems if there's new technology that's come out in the last 3 years. There's been a lot of research in the fire community with some grants being provided by the federal government to research and understand fire at a much better and deeper level, and that has spurred some additional change. So while I understand that there's concern about how often we come back with these fire code changes, oftentimes they're as a result of changes that benefit the community.
So what Dean has been talking about is one part of the discussion, which is emergency access to a development, to make sure that there is adequate provision for that. And so that's really what the fire code is addressing. The other part of the question or the discussion is, what about the permanent second road access? How does that going to get done? And what we've done since the recession is a couple of things. We've worked with the development community, with the council to update our subdivision ordinance. So with our subdivision construction agreement that we now have, when a development plan like this is approved by the city council, prior to the first phase of construction, the developer has to get this agreement approved by engineering, and now they have to post security to make sure that the required improvements are done within a 2-year time period, and we've never had that before the recession. So that's another big change to our process. So the time period for phasing these developments is basically on a 2 to 3 year cycle. And so that's another big improvement. And again, with this example that has recently gone through city council approval, this is a preliminary plan for a pretty large development. At the top of the map is a mutual access off of 26th Street that ties into the adjacent development. And then as you go around the map, you can see that there are other future access points to 6 Mile Road to the east, to the south, and then another, 2 to the south, and then another one in the future to the west to the adjoining development. So the developer, along with staff, will sit down and say, how can we phase this plan so that we can make sure that we're going to meet the requirements? And I think this is a much better process, again, than what we've had in the past. So the good news is that we're working through these older developments. As Dean said, that we're seeing with the pace of construction that there's more of those that are now in compliance than there was even 3 months ago. And with our new process that we have in place with engineering requirements, we're going to see those secondary roads completed in a more timely fashion. So that's kind of the non-technical update that we have at this point. And I think what we would like to do is to continue maybe to come back on maybe that 3-month time period to give you even more updates. And if there are specific areas that you still hear about or you think that we should be investigating, please let us know and we'll take a look at those. I will also say in closing that the Canterbury Heights one is going to be coming back to you within, I think we deferred that to August.
4th.
So we're going to be coming back to you in August, hopefully with a proposal to deal with how we're going to implement that secondary road on a more permanent basis. So we're working through these pretty well, and we've made some real big strides in the last few months. Dean, anything else you wanted to? So is there anything that we've missed today
I don't think so. Any other
that is of
comments?
concern to you?
I think that covers kind of the progress. Anybody in the audience have anything they need to bring up? No?
Nothing
All right.
about fees today, so.
No fees today.
For another time.
We're all feed out.
Development fees. But we appreciate the chance to keep you updated, and I know this is an important issue for us to keep our,
You know,
keep
and
on
it's
top of.
unfortunate with the recession, how it took place and how we had to make changes to allow some of this to maybe take place. And so I appreciate you looking at it in further detail for us. I know we've been sending you additional development.
Yes. We'll keep adding those to
developments.
our list.
So, thank you so much. Any other comments? Any open discussion?
I do.
Yes?
Chief Lanier? I'm not sure if you'll, well, I'd like you to speak to our apartment fire that we had recently and some of the challenges that the fire department encountered fighting that fire.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to answer that question. I think there's some minimal expectations when people pick up the phone and dial 911. I think they expect us to respond quickly, and when we get there, to make things better. So with that in mind, an apartment fire on a 3-story building is something that we all don't necessarily, as chief officers in the fire service, we understand that's an interesting problem to try to fix quickly. In responding to that incident, we initially met all of the benchmarks that we have for ourselves as a response agency to get there quickly and to do some things quickly. There were some challenges, I would tell you that. This apartment building bordered a street that was under construction at the time that was very proximate to the building that was on fire. And things could have gone quite a bit differently if some other things like wind direction, speed, and that type of thing weren't working in our favor. So we were able to contain most of the fire damage to the roof of the 3-story apartment building. There were a couple of units that sustained some very significant damage. We've had the opportunity to talk now with several insurance private fire investigators that have worked the scene and looked at what we saw that night as well. But just from a response perspective, I know it doesn't look good as to what you see on TV, but from my experience, having an attic fire in a multi-story apartment building, that's a pretty good save. To give you some perspective, and I'm not talking poorly about any of our sister cities, but a similar type of event occurred in one of our sister cities to the north. The whole building basically was a total and complete loss. So having attic fires is something that if you talk to most response firefighters, that's something that really kind of scares them. It's a tough situation to deal with. It's a hard fire to fight. It's a hard fire to stop. And then it's a hard one to deal with because of the elevation and trying to get into a place. The challenge of having a street that's under construction was unique, but we were still able to overcome that. So from my perspective, what we suffered was about as good as it gets for what we could hope for mitigating the loss.
Councilor Uppenbach.
I might just continue with that. Just because we do talk about building codes so often when we're in this situation, if you talk just a little bit, if you look at that building now, it looks very clearly like that firewall that is required in the code did its job. Does that firewall go all the way to the roof by code?
By code, a fire separation would have to start at grade, right at the floor level, and go vertically all the way through the roof. So it serves as a complete separation, basically separating the building into two parts. Often, in something that big, you may see multiple fire separations inside a building, but that's the function and purpose of a separation, is to create something of what we would call a separate fire area, but really, in function, it's separating the building from the top of the roof all the way to the ground.
Right. For me, it was really interesting because a citizen pointed that out to me as someone that lives in that neighborhood, and we were just chatting about it, and he said it's pretty clear that works. And so I guess from a city council perspective, I hadn't really thought about that before, but we're always talking about code and how expensive code is, and we make it adds cost and whatever. Nobody died in this fire, and there was very little in the way of injuries even. That firewall did its job.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
The thing that I would tell you is that the building itself predated sprinkler provisions, so that was one of the reasons why you saw the employment of fire separations. I've done my research every which way, and I have this conversation often with developers and builders when they come to town. Really, at endpoint, I don't know what we're going to do much for that building other than try to repair and piece it back together. But we displaced 30-some different tenants out of that building for an extended period of time. Counselor, if I could tell you the number of times in the last 12 months that we've had sprinkler saves inside of apartments, and everybody goes back in their apartment and they're back sleeping in their own bed that night, it's starting to pile up on me. It's been more than a handful just in the 6 months, just in the first 6 months of 2015. Mm-hmm. The dollar loss numbers that is experienced of a sprinklered facility or apartment building versus non-sprinklered, you're talking at least double the loss. So I know there was concern about that, but as we've moved along, the more and more evidence that we find, the more we find out that sprinkler provisions are really starting to pay huge dividends for us, not only from not displacing residents, but also just from a fire loss perspective. It's paying huge dividends.
Double is what you said. If my
double.
apartment is sprinkled and I'm in an apartment that's not sprinkled, the cost savings is double.
I looked at the last 12 months for those facilities that weren't sprinklered, and this was prior to the fire on Valhalla. There was more than $500,000 of loss. In the buildings that were sprinklered, there was less than $30,000.
That's unbelievable. I mean, it's just really remarkable. Again, just a lesson in, let's talk philosophy. Let's talk about this the next time we're talking building codes. It makes a difference. It makes a difference in these people's lives, and that's what we're supposed to be doing up here. We're supposed to be public servants, and that's remarkable. So thanks. I appreciate the conversation. Thanks for bringing it up.
And just to finish up on that, so this building was not sprinkled then?
Was not sprinkled. No, sir.
That's amazing.
And that's the reason why I said this was about as good a save as it gets, because you would not find very many places that would be able to get that fire stopped and put out once it's into the attic. That's extremely tough.
Well, then what I'm going to say is what I saw was a very professional, well-trained unit that our citizens can depend on. And I want to thank you and every member of our first responders for everything that you guys do in our city.
I appreciate it. I'll be sure to share that with Chief Sedaris. I'm sure he'll appreciate those comments.
Thank you. Anything else?
Move to adjourn.
All right, committee adjourned.